explained it to me. Selling these assets...
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Thank you, Mr
I
Chairman.
call the Honourable Minister Tony Ryle.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. It's very interesting that the previous member talked about the burden that this would have for future generations. The fact is that increased debt is a burden for future generations. If you're worried about stealing from your grandchildren, burdening them with debt that they don't need is the biggest part of it. Some of the more informed members of the House have asked a couple of questions about the treaty clause. Be very clear with the member, the current treaty clause in the State-Owned Enterprises Act does not apply to the state-owned enterprises, it applies to the Crown in right of New Zealand. So the obligations rest with the Crown. Now that exact obligation is being transferred, to the new legislation, and those obligations remain the same. And that's the advice that the Select Committee got from the officials during the committee stage, and it also recognises, and the advice the committee got was that the memorial regime that currently exists, which gives Māori specific rights on land that may or may not be transferred, that remains as well. Now, it's very important to know that there are, as a penalties regime around those who breach this legislation. Those who breach the 10% cap risk losing the voting rights. An SOP means that they will also lose their dividends of those shares in excess, and there is also a criminal offence in breaching those securities rules. Right now, and members opposite may not be aware of this, but many New Zealanders will be, that a company or a holder of investments or shares in a publicly listed company must declare their holding once it's at 5%, and then they must declare every 1% increase in their holding thereafter. If they fail to do that, they are then subject to quite significant penalties and legislation that includes not only a criminal breach, but also a significant sanction. And the significant sanction is they stand to have shares confiscated. And in fact, I think in the last decade, there was a company that lost a high-profile public organisation, a high-profile private company, lost, I think, 6 million shares in an investment company as a result, apparently, of failing to disclose step increases in their shareholdings. So there are quite significant penalties. Losing voting rights, losing dividends of the excess shares, that's part of the SOP that we're bringing in, that we tabled on Monday, the criminal sanctions that apply to this, and the very severe sanction that shares could be confiscated if people fail to honour their obligations under those securities expectations. Those are very, very significant penalties, and I think any investor in the New Zealand stock market of any size is well aware of those and acts to make sure they respect that in order to avoid the confiscation. This is, I think, a very good approach to a state-owned enterprise sales program. I think it replicates what we saw in the Shipley government, where we sold shares in the Auckland International Airport to ordinary New Zealanders. It was called a great example of popular capitalism by the Treasurer at the time. We also had a public float for the sale of shares in government property services, which had significant thousands of New Zealanders take shares in that. And also when it came to Contact Energy, the government helped create, I think, 120,000 first-time shareholders, I think, were resulted in the Contact share float. The big issue here is the Labour Party opposite doesn't think everyday people are good enough to own shares and they can't be trusted. They don't think the electrician from West Auckland, who's worked hard and is trying to save for his or her retirement, should own shares. They think they're a bit uppity that they might want to own shares and they can't be trusted because they've called that person part of a small elite. That's what they called him, part of a small elite. The nurse who's got a bit of money from her wages that she wants to put into an infrastructural investment in these times. She's part of a small elite, and she can't be trusted either. She can't be trusted because the minute she gets an offer for 10 cents more than she paid for her shares, apparently she's going to sell them. Just like that. 10 cents. The fact is, a lot of everyday people want the opportunity to own these shares. Mr. Chairman, a lot of everyday people want the opportunity to participate because this gives them a good savings opportunity. Many members will remember what it was like when the finance companies collapsed under the Labor government's mismanagement. Many people came along and they put their money into Blue Chip, Five Star Finance, Capital and Merchant, Hanover, and they lost it. They lost it. And the government did very little, that previous government, about those situations. They let the securities legislation and the prudential management fall into disrepair, and that's what happened. And Honourable Simon Power had to basically run the process for the previous government, under the Labor government, to tidy it up. So a lot of people know that they need to be cautious about investment. But as our Kiwi savers and our super funds and iwi accumulate financial resources, and there's over $100 billion on term deposit in New Zealand today, they are looking for opportunities to invest in infrastructure, to invest in yield. And that's what part of the government's mixed ownership model program is about. It's about creating investment opportunities for New Zealanders, not only as individuals, but also as families, as iwi, as KiwiSaver, as their super fund. Right now, the KiwiSaver people's KiwiSaver funds have probably got more invested in energy companies in overseas jurisdictions than they have in New Zealand. We want to, the super fund sure has, says Mr. Foss. So we want to create those opportunities for New Zealanders to have a wider range of investments that they can have. And we're backing that with the mixed ownership model program. But we also trust New Zealanders to make these investment decisions. We don't think people are uppity because they want to own shares. I remember when we made tens of thousands of people first-time shareholders in the late 1990s, people took great pride in their share certificates. They took great pride in their share certificates. And they put them on their mantelpieces, I'm sure many of them did, because it was actually the first time they were able to buy shares. Only 10% of New Zealanders own shares directly, contrast with I think about 30% in Australia. So there is a need for New Zealanders to have this opportunity. But Labor doesn't trust them. They say the minute someone comes along and offers them 1 cent more, they're going to sell them. They're going to sell them they're going to sell them straight away. The fact is, Port of Tauranga proves the opposite. 55% local government, 45% on the share markets. And what we're finding there is the New Zealanders are buying out. Oh, what a shocking example, says Mr. Andrew Little. How pathetic. Sad little man. Accusing them of killing people. That is sad. Look, it doesn't even warrant. God, so sad. So this is about New Zealanders investing in infrastructure and having those opportunities, and it stands in complete contrast to when Labor was last in office. Dr. Nick Smith made the comment about the mine on the west coast, that Labor ministers apparently approved the sale of 49% of Spring Creek to foreign interests. Foreign interests. They approved the sale, apparently, to foreign interests. What were the caveats? Well, I don't know the caveats, but one minister approved it from the Overseas Investment Office perspective. So Labor were happy to sell an energy company portion to foreigners at that time, but now that they're in opposition, they've changed their mind. They don't think it should be sold to foreigners. They think there should be restrictions on foreign. They've changed their mind. So when they were selling $10 billion of public assets to the highest foreign bidders and Faye Richwhite, they didn't tell anyone about that. When they sold them to the highest foreign bidders, Faye Richwhite and the elite, and the elite, they didn't want to tell New Zealanders, but this Prime Minister has been upfront from January 2011, centrepiece of the election campaign. They got the lowest result they'd ever had since 1915, apparently. And National got the highest vote under MMP. That's a mandate, but we take it very seriously, and that's the reason why we're working hard to secure a better future for New Zealanders.
I call the Honourable Member Grant Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's a frightening